Story 1. Explosion of the Challenger in 1986. My childhood hero Wubbo Ockles went into space late 1985. Because of him, I wanted to become an astronaut, not so much after the disaster. Story 2. My mom told me we have to throw away our garden vegetables because of the rain. Totally crazy for me as a child because Japan was and is so far away from our country. Story 3. Cuban Missile Crisis. I lived in West Palm Beach, and Palm Beach International Airport was assumed to be a target. There were Boeing B-47 Stratojets with nuclear weapons we heard, parked at the airport during the standoff, and a friend and I would walk down to see them. Quite a few duck and cover drills at school. Story 4. Ronald Reagan attempted assassination on March 30, 1981. Then 6 weeks later Pope John Paul attempted assassination on May 13, 1981. I forgot. The first space shuttle launch was on April 12, 1981. A busy 6 weeks. And John Lennon was assassinated on December 8, 1980, 4 months before this. Story 5. Nelson Mandela's release from jail. My mum came rushing in and turned the television on. 4-year-old me couldn't work out what was so exciting about footage of a man and woman walking down a road waving at people. But the air of excitement stayed with me. I don't remember it, but my mum tells me that I watched the Hillsborough disaster unfolding live on television until she realized what was happening and switched it off. Story 6. September 11th. I was in first grade at the time, and the school principal rushed into our classroom, told our teacher to turn on the ceiling-mounted television that was in our room, start calling our parents to come pick us up, and left. As soon as our teacher got the television turned on to the news channel, the second plane hit. The teacher immediately turned it off and began calling our parents. My mom was at work, so my aunt came to get me since my older cousin was in the same school. All she told us was that something very, very bad has happened and we need to go home. The next day, the Federal Bureau of Investigation showed up at my mom's place of work, the county health department, since it turned out one of the hijackers had taken his family there to get their physicals. She said she had never been so scared before in her life, and she was only getting questioned. They were gone in 30 minutes. Story 7. Madeline McCann. I'm 26. Happened I think 2 years after my family, and I went to Portugal. And I was told I looked a lot like her because of my shoulder-length blonde hair and blue-green eyes. Story 8. I would say Bush invading Iraq. I do remember September 11th and the Challenger, but was honestly too young to comprehend. Bush invading Iraq stuck a little harder because I remember my town raising money to buy body armor for our next-door neighbor's son who was deployed in Afghanistan. Story 9. Ice storm 1998 in Montreal. We lost electricity on the day of my 4th birthday and were stuck at home. Mom had made 2 huge cakes for all the children to share at the daycare, but we stayed home. We ate them throughout the week, and it felt like a vacation. To have my parents at home for a while and to travel to family members who hadn't lost electricity. They were stressed, but for us children, it was 2 weeks of excitement. Story 10. There are parts about the Yugoslav wars that I recall seeing on the news, especially in regard to Kosovo, such as the accidental strike on the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. Story 11. Mount St. Helens volcano explosion and Bobby Sands hunger strike. Can't remember which was first. I didn't understand why some guy wasn't eating, but it was all over the news, and there was an update every night on the news my parents watched about how many days he hadn't eaten. Story 12. Kidnapping and murder of Chelsea King. I was 12. It happened in San Diego, where I grew up, and I remember seeing, "Have you seen me?" flyers posted on the entrance doors of the swim club I went to. I was scared to go walking by myself for a long time after that. Danielle Van Dam lived in the neighborhood near me, and I was 6 when she was kidnapped and killed. My sister and I were rightfully frightened of strangers during that time period. Story 13. September 11th. I was in a Russian orphanage watching it on television. I just found out a couple from America were going to come visit me. Then September 11th happened. At 7 years old, I thought they died since I didn't have a concept of the size of the United States. They ended up flying out 2 weeks later to see me. Story 14. The disappearance of Jeanette Tate. I was 6, no idea why my parents were letting me watch the news. Story 15. Oklahoma City bombing. First time I ever saw my mom cry and didn't know why, but found out much later that they had shown the images of the kids being carried out. Story 16. A solar eclipse in the 70s. I was homesick from school. Mom let me watch live coverage in the living room. For a couple of seconds outside our windows, it was dark as night. I thought the sun had a dimmer switch. Story 17. Baby Jessica is the first story I remember watching on TV. The Berlin Wall coming down and then the death of Ryan White were the first stories I recall watching in school. Story 18. The first time that I was actually aware of the news was September 11th. I was in the 4th grade. I remember the teachers being weird all day. When my mom picked me up, she was crying. Of course, it was on television and newspapers and unavoidable for months afterwards. Story 19. That I technically remember if I think about it. Princess Diana's death, but mostly because I saw how upset my mother was by it, and little girl me was shocked that princesses could die. I also believed everyone lived to be 100. But the first major event I actually remember, September 11th attacks. Edited to add, I almost forgot the Columbine High School massacre. I was starting school that year and was shocked at the idea of dying at school. My poor brain was so confused because all the adults were hyping me up for going to school. Story 20. Virginia Tech Massacre. We lived overseas on an Air Force base. It was so surreal watching it on the news. It felt so close to home but so alien. Plus, I was only 7, so it was confusing. Story 21. September 11th, my regularly scheduled programming of watching people get low-scale hurt on the 9 a.m. You've Been Framed broadcast, for non-British, fail army before YouTube was a thing, was interrupted with the events in New York. Story 22. Elvis Presley's death. We were driving home from the Knights of Columbus pool, we were Catholic, in my mom's boat of a 1976 Ford Gran Torino station wagon, when news came on the AM radio we were listening to. I can still remember the smell of superheated. It was August in Dallas. Vinyl bench seats mixed with the chlorine from the pool. Story 23. Sandy Hook shooting. I was 7 at the time, and now that I have 2 babies of my own, I couldn't imagine the fear of hearing that in the news and having to send my kids to school the next day. Story 24. Bicentennial. Gas lines. Iran hostages. John Lennon assassination. Ronald Reagan shooting. Bud Dwyer. Challenger explosion. 1987 market crash. Michael Jackson's hair on fire. Story 25. A while after Patty Hearst was kidnapped, my mom was watching the news. My ears perked up when I heard them saying there were gorillas in the building, and they didn't know how many. I kept trying to see the gorillas. My mom didn't like me asking questions, so it was years before I found out they were gorillas, not gorillas. Story 26. I was 8 years old in 1986 when the Challenger explosion occurred, and then in 1987, I became completely absorbed in the story of Jessica McClure, the baby girl who fell in the well and was rescued. Story 27. I'm 58, originally from the United Kingdom. For me, teenagers didn't watch the news. That was for old people. But I was 14 and remember watching and being hooked on the Iranian embassy siege in 1980 in London. All of the United Kingdom was glued to the television watching the Special Air Service abseil down the building and storm the building. Story 28. The whole Amy Fisher and Buttafuoco story. Joey Buttafuoco had an affair with underage Amy Fisher, and Amy Fisher ended up shooting his wife, Mary Jo, in the face. Wild story. Amy was sentenced to 15 years but got out on parole after 7, and Joey only served 4 months for statutory rape. Crazier still is that Mary Jo stayed with him after all that. Story 29. I was 12 at the time. It was the first time I ever sat and watched the news nonstop, no matter how many times they just repeated the same things, waiting for any new updates. I never could have imagined at the time that it would only be the first of many school shootings I would watch on the news. Story 30. Granville train disaster. A Sydney-bound peak-hour train derailed and crashed into a bridge, which then fell onto it. 83 people were killed. I also remember my brother and me setting up the Lego train and pushing a heap of Lego blocks into it to recreate it. I was 5. I also recall my teacher one morning later that year asking if anyone had heard any news. Someone said Elvis had died. I just sat there wondering what an Elvis was. Story 31. Sputnik first satellite circles the Earth. You could hear it on the radio and see it with your naked eye. I think the next that sticks is the Kennedy assassination. Story 32. Kennedy being shot and watching his funeral on our black and white television. My mom told me I sat there with tears streaming down my face. I was 8 and my dad had just died that September. Story 33. It's weird. I can't remember any major notable news story earlier than seeing John Wayne's death announcement on the New York Post paper my father brought home one day in 1979, when I was 13 years old. I mean, there was the end of the Vietnam War before that, but I have no memory of the news stories from that. Story 34. The Clinton-Lewinsky scandal. I still remember my dad, a Clinton Democrat to this day, furiously ranting about that hypocrite Gingrich while the evening news was on. Story 35. I am a little bit young, 18 years, but the big news story I remember hearing of was Nelson Mandela's death on the news. I didn't know who he was at the time, but I knew he was significant somehow. Story 36. Inquire, a boy swallowed a turtle whole. It was front-page news for a month as it progressed through his stomach. For those who don't know, Inquire is or was a trash newspaper. Story 37. Two jumbo jets collided at Tenerife Airport, known as the Tenerife Airport disaster. In local London news, someone was kidnapped and had poison administered in an unusual way. Additionally, someone was killed by a spy with an umbrella. This was Georgy Ivanov Markov. Back then, everyone in London carried these black, pointy umbrellas, and to this day, I won't use an umbrella, worried the pointy ends might poke someone's eye out. Story 38. I am old. My first memory was Kennedy's assassination. I was quite young but could see that my parents and relatives were very upset by it. And because it happened on a Friday, it probably meant no cartoons on Saturday morning television. And I was right. Story 39. Jerry Conlon being exonerated. I had no idea what I was watching at the time since I was so young, but years later when I watched the film In the Name of the Father, and it got to the end, it suddenly flooded back to me that I'd watched that final scene of the movie, where he is in front of the courthouse talking to reporters in real time. Story 40. The Loma Prieta earthquake collapsed the Embarcadero elevated highway in San Francisco. We had just moved away from there a week or so before, and my mom's former office was damaged when the highway came down. It was terrifying to realize how easily it could have been my mom in one of those crushed cars buried under a miles-long multi-level freeway. Story 41. Marvin Gaye being killed by his father. I remember going into the kitchen and telling my mom and dad. I didn't know exactly who he was, but I knew he was famous. Story 42. I remember taking home permission slips. If there is a threat of thermonuclear war, do you want your child to stay at school or start walking? It was during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Story 43. JFK assassination. I was 5 years old and remember how it rattled my family and tiny child routine. The television was on constantly, and we even ate our dinner in front of it. Unprecedented, but that's what I remember most. Story 44. I didn't see the news story, but I saw the event itself. Early memories are generally unreliable, but I do remember being shaken awake by my mom in the family car. I asked her what time it was, and she said about 12:30, and I kind of knew what that meant. I was about 4 years old enough to understand the time of day and night. A few minutes later, there was a very loud noise, and I remember a bright light near the horizon suddenly coming on and climbing into the sky. I distinctly remember how it was bright enough to cause the clouds to cast shadows that angled down as it rose up. And that was my experience watching the launch of Apollo 17 at 12:33 a.m. My parents have been gone a few years now, but there are extensive family pictures of that trip with me in them. That is the earliest memory I have with evidence to support it. Earliest news story? I remember Walter Cronkite on television talking about Vietnamese gorillas. I didn't know the word gorilla, and commercials for Tang, the drink of the astronauts. Story 45. Elvis dying. I was in the car on the way to preschool, and my mother bought a newspaper. She never did that, and was crying her eyes out. I was old enough to know who he was and some of his songs, but she really took it badly. Story 46. Kennedy assassination. I was in third grade, and we had all come back from the bathrooms. Our teacher was crying, and we all went home. We all walked to school. Story 47. The ATF siege at the Branch Davidian compound in Waco. Whenever I hear Waco mentioned now, even 30 years later, that's the first thing that comes to mind. Story 48. Lorraine Bobbitt. I was probably 7 or 8, but I remember that was huge news. Followed up with O.J. Simpson trial, JonBenet disappearance, Princess Diana passing away, and the Bill Clinton drama. Core memories for me. Story 49. Cat died. All I remember is walking down the stairs from our condominium while I was still in ballet wear. Then I can't remember anything except being in my car seat, and I don't remember what anyone said. Then my cat was home with something on her leg that might have been a cast. Then I never saw her again. Miss you, Savannah. Story 50. I was 4 years old, at my grandmother's house for Thanksgiving in 1963. John F. Kennedy's funeral procession was on television. All the women in my family were crying. Story 51. When the U-2 spy plane was shot down in 1960, the United States Air Force did not think either the plane or a pilot could survive a 70,000-foot fall, so naturally, they lied repeatedly about what the plane was doing flying over the Soviet Union. I was only 12, so I had an excuse for believing President Dwight D. Eisenhower when he lied. He was the first president who, I felt, ever lied to me. Now, I cannot think of one who never did. Story 52. 1993 World Trade Center attack. My grandpa worked in the World Trade Center, and I remember my mom running into the room, flipping through channels on the TV and only seeing static. She popped in a Cinderella vase tape, told me not to leave my room, and closed the door sobbing.